Welcome, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. You don't know, but this talk has been uh, something I've been working on for the last 15 years. So I'm super happy to finally present it and talk about some of the open source things that I've learned in the last couple years and the things I've seen and the people I've met. So super excited. So we heard Kevin yesterday talking about 6 impossible things you can't do. Today, I would like to talk about 7 things you actually can do and as part of open source. But let me start off with a very quick story. This exception actually changed my thinking of how people work with software. So it was like almost 15 years ago. I was working in a small development shop, and we were running trainings for other companies using certain libraries. And so when I was running one of those trainings and I helped the people to learn about those frameworks, and suddenly someone said, "Hey, Benny, I have a problem. I have an exception. I don't know what to do." And so we looked together at that exception, and it was some null pointer exception. And I was like, "Okay, like click on it. Like, what's null in that case?" And he was like, "I'm not going to click that." I was like, "Why not?" Because this is framework code. I'm not going to touch framework code. Like, we're a company. We have our own code base. I'm not smart enough to touch framework code. And that made me realize, for that person at that time, the stack trace, like the part of the stack trace that was part of the library, was unreachable for him. And it was not that it was unreachable in the sense that it was closed source. It was actually open source. It was that there was a mental barrier to reaching into other libraries and figuring out how they work. And that made me realize that I and others I worked with had a different mindset coming from an open source background than other people. And for the last years, I tried to capture that somehow. And that's why I'm here. And that's why I would love to tell my story. So I'm Benny. I work at GitHub, currently working on the Copilot project, which is an AI programming tool to help you work. I'm also a Java champion and a huge open source enthusiast. I used to be a very active committer on the Eclipse project, the Eclipse IDE. I used to work on the Gradle build tool and lots of other small things here and there. But yeah, open source was always part of my day-to-day life. And so one of the things I want to touch on today is how we can break into open source, why we should even consider doing it, and what lies ahead of us, and what's actually what's in there for us to even consider doing that. And so when you look at open source, I see four large pillars, how they can affect your life and your career. For one, it's learning and fun. Like, working on open source is a lot of fun at times when you actually get to meet people, find new opportunities, actually work together with different people you would have never met. And you can also help your company to drive actually your own processes forward and actually learn something in open source that you can bring back into your company. And so I would like to talk about 2 different ways of contributing today, or 2 ways of working with open source. And this is where kind of the path splits into different adventures. So one of the adventure is you can actually go and maintain your own project. Like, you can have your own project, you put it out there as open source, and initially that might be hard. Like, there will be lots of rocks and stones in your way. It's your own adventure. You have to go through that alone, and hopefully maybe at some point somebody joins you. Or you can take a different path and actually contribute to an existing project that's already set up and established. It has kind of like a paced path, and at the same time it also has like its own rules and settings that you have to adhere to. So it's not one, or it's not exclusive. You can do both of them. It's just different in the way you approach things and different in the things you can learn from them. And I would like to actually talk about both of the ways and how they influenced me over time and others I've met along the way. So looking back, my first open source project, it was actually still in school. It was kind of way back when. And at the time I was playing around with PHP. I was a huge PHP fan. That's long ago. And at some point, I actually found this super interesting project called ExistDB, which was an XML database. Nowadays, you would call it NoSQL database, but actually that term, it was coined already, but it was not used in the industry. So they actually called it an XML database. It was actually predate things like MongoDB and others. And I had no reason to use ExistDB other than I was curious. I was interested in like, okay, they do things differently. Like I knew relational databases, and I wanted to see something new, and was playing around with that. I actually learned something about XSLT and XPath and those kind of things. And given my main language was PHP, there was no real integration with PHP. So I set out at one evening and said, I want to create like a client library to talk to this thing. Like they exposed some APIs, and I actually went ahead and built a small open source project. I think it had 2 classes. It was a lot of work. It just 2 classes, but it was a lot of work for me back in the days with the knowledge I had. And I even proposed it at Peer. Peer is the PHP package manager. I'm actually not sure if that still exists today. And so how it works is you can't just upload any packages. You actually propose them, and there's a committee of people who vote on it. And so that whole process went on for, I think, half a year. And the package, once it was accepted, was a huge success. It had 4 downloads. I think 3 of them were me, and maybe one was someone else. And it was actually, like, looking back, it was one of the best things I've done at that point, because I learned so much about what to do. It was not a huge success in a sense that a lot of people use it, but I learned a lot doing it. I learned to write a product proposal and actually got feedback from other people how to do that. Actually, people who have seen other packages who were actually deeply integrated into the PHP community. I learned how to properly document APIs. At that point, I didn't know PHP doc existed really, or I didn't care. And that made me actually think about properly documenting my APIs. Another thing at that point was it wasn't clear whether REST is cool or not. So they actually made me structure it in a way that you can actually exchange the drivers. You could use either SOAP or REST for that package, which actually made me learn about the strategy patterns and how to use that. And it's also about licensing, like what license to choose and how to do that. So for me, that was like a huge success because I learned so much as part of that, even though I had no downloads. Interestingly, I think one download came from someone else. I got an email at some point, someone telling me, hey, I'm writing a book about XML databases. And he actually mentioned me in that book. And he actually sent me like a copy of that book, which made me super proud. There's no money involved and nothing. It was just a nice gesture, and I was super happy. And so that was actually one of the first key lessons I learned. Success in open source is defined by what you learn from it. Open source can actually provide you an environment where people come together and learn together. You don't have to know everything, because nobody knows everything, and you have to like take that first step and be willing to learn on the way. And so this is also how we meet our first friend and colleague, which is Alex. So Alex is a CEO at Bradex, and she was also heavily involved in the Eclipse community because her company is actually building one of the open source projects at Eclipse. And she also phrased it that way when I interviewed her for the talk. She said the biggest impact open source made in your career is teaching her how the community can work together instead of being in competition. And it's actually a mindset that changes around, that you stop competing and actually try to work together also between different open source projects. So that's something that also resonated quite a bit with me, that this feeling of community and working together in things actually makes a huge difference and shapes your thinking and lets you rethink a lot of things. Let's go on to my first contribution to a large open source project. So I've done lots of smaller things, but I think the largest open source project I used to work on back in the days, that was Eclipse. So Eclipse, I wasn't a PHP developer. I used Eclipse as an IDE because people kept telling me I should use IDEs. Didn't understand it, but there you go. And so I found that one problem, and I thought, okay, let's be nice. Let's report a bug report at Eclipse, which was this one. This was actually my first bug I reported at Eclipse. And it was closed as invalid. Same story. It was not a problem that it's invalid because actually 2 committers explained to me why it is invalid and actually gave me the context to understand how to do it right. So I actually learned, again, something from that interaction. It's no problem that the bug is closed because I didn't need that feature anymore because I now knew the right way to do things. And actually, like, that was the start of me contributing more to Eclipse. And over the years, I actually accumulated almost 1,000 bugs I reported to Eclipse, to various projects. And it's interesting looking back to that, how those interactions actually shaped the future of my career. If we look at the first 4 bugs here, you see the second one here. There's someone assigned to it called Robert Elves. On the discussion, like on the bug itself, I also had a discussion with someone named Kirsten and Stefan Pingle. And it was interesting because through that interaction on the open source project we are talking about here, which was Myelin, I actually found a job that I worked for 10 years. That was a huge part of my career. And all that started contributing back to open source, reporting defects, and later on also contributing code. And it's interesting because I share a very similar story to one of my colleagues back then, which is Stefan. And Stefan is a principal engineer at TASOP right now. And for him, it was also like he was working on the Myelin project as an open source contributor. And he also met so many great people along the way who helped him to find his place in the world. And so, for example, the Myelin project lead, McKirsten, who's also the CEO of that company, is someone who actually discussed with all the people on the open source project how to move things forward. And Stefan says it here, I can say with confidence that the open source enabled that connection to Mick and all the other people. And it was, for example, the same for me. Those interactions also with Stefan allowed me to join that company later on. And especially for me, the company was sitting in Vancouver, I'm sitting in Germany. And we actually, through open source, we built up so much trust that they actually trusted me to work remotely as the first engineer, being remote to that company. So that was quite cool to showcase you can work in asynchronous fashion through open source. And that's the second key lesson I want to share with you. Contributions are more than code. The interactions are as important as code. Interactions with the community, with reporting defects, actually helping with the defects. And that's something that we will actually see again later in the talk. So let's go on to our first code contribution to a large project. So far, we talked about bug reports and how to contribute that way. Let's talk about code contributions. We go back to our first 4 bugs in the Eclipse ecosystem. The fourth one is an example of how not to write a bug report. So the summary is pretty non-descriptive. You should definitely do better. The cool thing about that was that when I reported that feature request, the committers actually took the time to explain, oh yeah, that's not too hard. We have a few classes over here and over there, and this is how you could roughly do that. So they gave me actually enough context of the project specifics to actually go and try it myself. And trying it yourself, like, the first step is always the hardest. And it's funny because when I prepared the talk, in the internal GitHub communication channels, Alan Donovan, he was working at GitHub right now, who used to work at Google on the Go team. He actually stated the immutable law. The hardest part of any first-time contribution to an open source project is figuring out how to run its build tests. And that's so true. Like the first step to set everything up is usually the hardest. And if you're an open source maintainer, make that easy. There are various ways how to make that easier, because this is usually the thing where people give up. And if people push through that, things become a lot easier. So I actually spent 2 days trying to figure out how to like clone Eclipse and how to set everything up so I can actually change something and see if it works. And after a few days, I actually had a patch ready. What people didn't know, so they reworked the patch a little bit because it was just a 3-line patch and it had some problems with it. What most people didn't know, this is the first line of Java I've ever written, because I was not a Java programmer. I just wanted to fix that bug because it was annoying me all day long when I was using Eclipse, not writing Java, but actually writing PHP. And so this also helped me to expand my scope of knowledge, in the sense that I was learning a new programming language with direct feedback from some people who actually knew how to do that. So that was really great to see that. And as part of that, so you see it above, it was part of the PDE component in Eclipse. And so there was a team around that, sponsored by IBM, who were like the main committers on that. And one of them was Chris. And so Chris and me, we had lots of chats on different bug reports, on IRC channels, later on also on conferences, where we talked about open source and how to get people into it. And so, for example, he actually he's very active in the space right now. So he's the CTO of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and his biggest single impact from open source to his career was also an internship that he got through open source usage and contributions back in the days. And this actually helped him to also help others join the community, work together. He also helped others like me to, for example, get articles published on IBM, like DeveloperWorks platforms. So actually, he helped me again to get some exposure. And that's just great, how many great people you meet working in open source, and how you can actually help each other out as part of that. One very important thing to notice here, which is the key lesson I have here, is work on the thing that interests you. Don't try to grab an open source project that is maybe cool these days, but that you don't care about. It's really important that it interests you. It doesn't have to be something that you use daily. For example, I'm someone, I love working on the own tool, like on the tool chain that I'm using at any given point. That's why when I was using Eclipse, I was contributing to that. And for others, there was the same. But find something that truly interests you. And it's actually funny, when I was researching this, you see on the left there are a bunch of commits to the eGit project, which was the Git integration for Eclipse. And I never intended to actually contribute to that project. It was mostly, I loved Git and I really liked Eclipse as an IDE, but the IDE integration was not great at that point because Git was so new. And so I actually started contributing to that. And while researching this, I found it really funny to see that one of the reviewers, right in the middle there, is Kevin. And I lost contact with him after eGit, and I didn't know what he was up to. And when I researched the talk, I actually looked up where Kevin was working today, and I realized he was actually a principal engineer here at GitHub. So that was a nice connection again 10 years later. So we talked a lot about things you can do, but there's also that one thing that we haven't talked about yet. Like Benny, I got actually better things to do in my evenings than sitting there contributing to open source. And I get that. I completely get that. A lot of the things I talked about were part of a time when I had more time at my hands than, for example, I have today. So contributing to open source can also mean you try to combine it with the things you do day in, day out. And for that, it's important to understand how, for example, the company you work for has relations to open source. And for the sake of this talk, I just assume the products you're working on somehow depend on open source. One thing is to create awareness that your products depend on open source. That's, I think, very clear in the meantime. But what's often missed is how much churn we have in our commercial products and how many workarounds we put in there, because there are root causes that are not fixed, or that are still open in open source projects, or where we are missing features in open source projects and somehow try to work around them. And this is, I think, a great opportunity to actually make clear that by contributing to open source, you actually you actually help your own company and cut the costs that where you depend on it. So this is a great example. I used to work in a company where they actually copied around different classes as a workaround because there was a bug in an open source library, and it actually accumulated really, really bad over time. And at some point, I decided to go look into that, like what's the matter. And it turned out it sounded like a complex problem. It wasn't a complex problem. It was actually one line change and 6 lines of test code that I added. So a few hours of my work in open source actually saved us maintaining 6,000 lines of commercial code. And you will not always find those things, but usually when you look for it, it's usually obvious where to go and find some of that. So with that, let's talk about someone else who I met along the way who had a similar problem. So this is Mark. Mark is a senior principal engineer at Gradle. He's also the team lead of the JUnit team. And I found this just beautiful to talk about his first open source contribution. So he upgraded the dependency in JUnit 4 because his commercial product was using JUnit 4 and they had incompatible versions of some dependencies. So he went out, he upgraded the JUnit dependency, made all the changes to make it backward compatible. And once it was merged, nobody was around to actually do a release of JUnit at the time because the project was completely understaffed, which is actually not uncommon that very popular projects are understaffed. And so no one on the team had time to do it. So they actually asked Mark to take care of it. And so this was how Mark got involved in JUnit. This is how later on he actually proposed the funding round for JUnit 5 and actually created a team of people working on the next generation of JUnit. And this all started with a simple dependency upgrade in that project. It also leads to another thing, that doing those things is so important also for your career, to make the work you do visible to the outside. And that's actually another key takeaway from that I learned over the years. And actually, if you ask me, one of the major and most important takeaways: make your work visible. In all the jobs I've had so far, in the interview process, we talked about my open source contributions. We talked about the things I did in the open, because all the time I spent on commercial software, they shaped me as an engineer quite heavily. But they are also invisible to all the others outside, to your next employee, to other engineers. So it's important to make your work visible and actually have something you can talk about in public. So this is actually an investment in your life and your career to do that. Gaining expert knowledge is another thing that open source can actually provide in funny and curious ways. So there was, again, me being a user of Eclipse a couple of years later. So Eclipse has this search dialog, which has a lot of knobs and things. And it always felt like every time I used it, and search is actually a very important thing in your day-to-day work, it felt like something is off. It always did the wrong thing. It always focused on the wrong tab there, or the wrong text box. And it felt like it's more in my way than it actually helps me. So at some point, I decided I will go and try to fix it. I didn't know what the fix looked like yet, but I digged into the code and tried to see what the fuss is all about. And interestingly, once I found the code and I looked into that, I realized, oh, there's actually code in there that does exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't realize there is a customize button at the bottom already doing that. So great. I felt pretty stupid, to be honest. Like I didn't need open source to figure out there's a customize button. So I talked to another senior engineer at the company at the time and told him about my newest discovery, and realized this other person didn't know about this button either. So we had a fun day, and we kind of forgot about it. A couple of months later, we did the talk on tips and tricks how to use your IDE, and talked about this one at the same time inside our company. And actually 20 people came up to us thanking us for revealing that button, because somehow nobody ever noticed this button. It's so funny that just looking under the cover sometimes reveals obvious things that you didn't see before. Talking about obvious things, there's just recently I saw another very interesting implementation of things you take for granted and how different people see them differently. So here on the top you have that's how most people would implement factorial as a method in Java, like either as a recursive, or you can also do it in a loop. Doesn't matter. Recursive, for example, also involves how many stack frames you need. But for example, if you look in how Guava, the open source projects, implements that, they actually hard coded all the numbers to 20 in a way that the compiler optimizes that away. So it's actually constant lookup. And even better, you only need to do it until 20, because your range for long actually runs out after that. So you can't put any number grade, like no factorial after 20 into a long anyway. So there's no point in doing that. And it's so funny that also the most obvious things, once you actually look into different libraries, how many surprises you get there. Another way to gain expert knowledge is to actually go and proactively ask the maintainers. A lot of maintainers I know are super happy about questions. It actually goes so far. I think it was the Cucumber project, so the Cucumber test library. If they see a new contributor, they actually offer pairing sessions with them. So people can actually learn about the code base from the authors themselves, which I find pretty cool. You can also help out and look into the forums, RC, Gitter, Slack, whatever, to kind of watch how other people are using those frameworks you're using, and learn how others might suffer from the same problems you are and how they are solving those. So it's really helpful to usually have some connection to the project and see some of the discussions. And this is, for example, another project where I met someone really great, which is David. So David is principal engineer at Heroku, and we actually met in the Smarty forums a long time ago. Smarty used to be a template engine in PHP. We were both helping out and helping users to use that open source project. And also, he invited me to help out on another project after we met, which is called Agave, which was a pretty interesting web framework back in the days. And it had like a very, very solid structure. They had a lot of tests and how to do things. And it was actually an inspiration how they worked on this project. And they invited me and actually paired up with me so I could learn from their experience, which was pretty cool. So yeah. Another way to gain expert knowledge quick in a code base you don't know yet, especially if you're contributing, use different tools that are available to you. Use, for example, visualizations. The GitHub Next team, which is a research team at GitHub, actually published a repo visualization tool the other day, or actually weeks ago, to quickly get a glance of the structure of a project, or make heavy use of code search across the project. If you're on, for example, on GitHub, and you look at the repository on GitHub, just press dot on your keyboard. It will actually open up a VS Code instance with the whole project set up. That's actually my favorite feature these days. Another approach that I often use, but it heavily depends on the project. If it has tests, and you see a defect, just hack in your solution what you think is right, even if you're not feeling like submitting that as a PR. Change it and ask the tests how they think this, if this is actually acceptable. So this is actually a great way for you to discover, is this working or not? And one thing that I think all the things I've talked about are not only true for open source, but engineering in general. Ask the 5 why. If you report a bug to a project or a feature request, ask yourself why that bug exists or why that feature doesn't exist yet. And dig down into maybe there are actually reasons why they haven't built it yet. Maybe it's not because they didn't have time, but maybe it's because there are good reasons and actually better ways to do it. And also ask on the social channels of those projects to help you understand how the project vision is set up. And that actually brings me to Vlad. He's the CEO at Hypersistence. He's also a Java champion. He contributed a lot to projects like the Hibernate project. He's also working on lots of other things. I think most people know him from Stack Overflow and from his blog. So whenever you search about database in Java, you will usually end up on his blog, how to do things. And so he also said to me when we interviewed that studying source code of others and how they use the frameworks he uses was the most revealing thing for him. Like learning from other open source code and sharing the knowledge through that alley was one of the biggest impacts open source had on his career. So number 5, get your hands dirty. Go in there. It doesn't mean you have to provide a PR within an hour. It just means look at the code, see what you can learn from it. And maybe sometimes it's just you learn that there's a button you didn't see before. Worst thing that can happen to you is that you learn something new. All right, let's talk about some numbers. So this is a graph. You see an upwards trajectory. What could that be? In the context of an open source project, you have people with ideas how that project should evolve. If your project becomes more popular, or if you actually work on a more popular project, there are different people with more ideas and a lot of people with a lot more ideas. And actually, you get to a point that there are so many ideas that you actually can't keep up with that. And that's actually the graph of what it is about. This was Gradle, the open issues over time. And in the Gradle project, when I worked on it, it was actually a problem that there were so many like feature requests, not only bugs, but also feature requests, that it was actually impossible to decide what to do and what not to do. And so at one point we decided to kind of put a cap on that, because it actually became like, it was actually like inflicting so much work on the team that they couldn't get anything else done, because you were just managing like all the things that, like all the incoming things. And as part of the blog post I linked below, we actually put a cap on it and said, okay, we will actually mark things as stale after a certain period of time, and we choose very large windows in the beginning and restricted it down later on. But we said we actually going to close things that have no activity, and that doesn't mean it's invalid or that we disagree that this is a super cool feature. It really just means nobody has the time and bandwidth to look at that. And it actually worked very great with our community back then, because they realized that we want to pick out the things that are actually relevant and work on those, and try to not because we can't work on everything. It's simply impossible. No matter how many people you have on a project, you will never satisfy all the requests. So in order to focus on the important things, we try to do that. And you see that in other popular projects as well. This is, for example, VS Code. They had this is just the last month, they actually had a real spike in new issues. And if you look at the baseline, it's like roughly 5,500 open issues. So just managing that, not even fixing the issues or implementing the features, just managing the backlog of things is like a huge impact on an open source project. And so one of the people working on VS Code is Ben. So he's a principal software engineer at Microsoft working on VS Code directly. I met Ben back in the Eclipse days when we were both hanging out in the IRC channels. And for him, it was also one of the biggest impacts was a small tool he built back in the days called RSSO, which was an RSS reader based on Eclipse. And for him, the help and support from people around the world was a huge motivator to continue doing that. And a lot of people can actually help out on those things as well. It's not only contributing to a project doesn't mean code or new issues, it's also helping to figure out which issues are not relevant anymore, which defects cannot be reproduced anymore. If you're missing important information on almost every bug report, maybe consider using issue templates to solve that, help triaging those issues. So those are all things you can actually help the maintainers to focus on the actual problems. And this brings me to Lila, who's a product security engineer at GitHub. She actually was working outside tech and tried to break into tech a couple of years ago. And as part of that, she learned programming through an open source project called the Odin project. And as part of that, she actually became a contributor to the Odin project through non-technical contributions. So she worked on the courses there for other people to learn how to program. And this actually made her one of the top contributors to that project. And nowadays she's working at GitHub. So I found that story really inspiring, that by contributing to open source, she actually could break into tech. And that's the thing, help maintainers by creating space for their own contributions so they can actually do it. Quick chat about sponsoring. It's there, you can do that. I'm not going too far into that, but one thing I want to call out is a project called the Google Summer of Code, which is a sponsoring program initiated by Google, where essentially open source projects suggest ideas for people to work on, and students or young people can participate, and the young people actually get paid by Google for doing that during the summer. I can highly recommend it. I know a lot of people who've done that. I've done it myself a few times during my university years. And this is something how you can also help others by being a mentor if you're a part of an open source project. That brings me to Patience, who also used to do Google Summer of Code. And for example, she met her mentor there who, after a few years, she said, my mentor single-handedly got me a remote engineering job when I decided to move continents. And these are the connections you actually have through those open source contributions. And another very similar but actually different way of doing it is sponsorship. So not actually paying people money to do it, but actually helping with your position and your connections, helping others out and helping the open source projects out. So instead of saying, have you tried applying to speak at conferences, actually recommend someone to speak at the conference. Actually recommend an open source project to someone else. And this is actually one of the most interesting and best stories I've ever experienced in my life. As I said, I used to work on the IRC channels and helping people answer questions at Eclipse. And at some point, there was a time of EclipseCon, which is a conference hosted in Santa Clara in California. I was based in Germany. I was still in school, so I had actually no money to go to a conference like that. And someone on that channel who had actually pretty good connections to the organizers of the conference, he set it up so I was the official IRC reporter, which is kind of a joke. But that made me go to that conference. So it actually paid for me to go to that conference because I was a contributor to the open source project. And I vividly remember the Santa Clara Convention Center, and just thanks to that one person, which was called Philippe, who helped me with his connections and sponsored me in a way that he just said, hey, you pay the flight and your motel and I will get you into that conference for free. So yeah, till this day, this is one of the best stories I've ever experienced in open source. So help promoting those projects, help others participate in those projects as well. That's a key insight into that. So if we want to recover, because we're out of time here, key takeaways are use open source as your learning environment. use like there's so many people interested in helping out and mentoring others. So use that as your environment. Make your work visible, so the things you do, the cool things you do, are actually visible to others and to your future employees. Get your hands dirty, try it out. You don't have to submit it. You can try it out for your own. The worst thing that can happen is you learn something, and promote your favorite open source projects. I would like to thank you for your time. It was a pleasure being here. You can always reach me on Twitter at bmuskalla. If you don't have Twitter, you can reach me at bmuskalla@github.com. And I will leave you with this one tweet. Thank you so much.